Clause 5. Pervert his sense of right or prevent the exercise of his natural faculties. In the video, The Abuser's Mind, Vaknin talks about how NPD affects a narcissist's mind, or I would say his natural faculties. Vaknin says, quote, "To the abuser's mind, his victims do not merit humane treatment, nor do they evoke empathy, because they don't exist as human beings," end quote. In another video, he says, quote, "Narcissists lack a critical piece of equipment, the ability to empathize. Empathy is what binds us together. Empathy is the essence of what it is to be human. In the absence of empathy, emotions and cognitions are skewed, deformed," end quote. I don't think special training in semantics is needed to see connections between Cockburn's sense of right and Vaknin's lack of empathy, Cockburn's natural faculties and Vaknin's essence of what it is to be human, and Cockburn's perverted sense of right and Vaknin's skewed, deformed emotions and cognitions. Before I make things clearer with specifics from my father's actions and plans, let me quote a little more from writing contemporaneous and associated with Banks versus Goodfellow. Quote, "The court pointed to a moral responsibility of no ordinary importance. The instincts and affections of mankind, in the vast majority of instances, will lead men to make provision for those who are the nearest to them in kindred and who in life have been the object of their affections. To disappoint reasonable expectation of this kind is to shock the common sentiments of mankind and to violate what all men concur in deeming an obligation of the moral law," end quote. Vaknin again, "To the abuser's mind, his victims do not merit humane treatment. They don't exist as human beings." It took a few years of putting together puzzle pieces from different people, but not long ago I made a connection which landed in the middle of my understanding with a heavy thud that still reverberates months after I tied together threads from my legal research and my personal knowledge of my father. First, a brief summary. When my father died 6 months before my 50th birthday, my financial assets were zero. In addition, I will have no retirement from anywhere. I will very likely never get Social Security, and I will never get Medicare, Medicaid, or other health insurance. Even overseas insurance companies don't want someone with pre-existing conditions which could be linked to other health issues. Despite knowing this and knowing what he was doing would make the difference between life and death, my father spent his last weeks diverting monies in a plan to harm me and my family, and at the same time win himself praise from people around him, people who didn't know the specifics of the claim his own flesh and blood had. In brief, these people had no idea of the lies he was telling them, that he was in reality violating what all men concur in deeming an obligation of moral responsibility of no ordinary importance. In his last weeks, my father was sending anonymous donations to widows he knew through church. He was tipping hospice staff. He was diverting major money and impoverishing the assets by 25%. Besides winning himself lots of praise for his lie and facade of generosity, he was depleting trust assets principal as much as he could before he died, ensuring there will not be money available for his flesh and blood to seek medical help for a life-endangering medical event. Or he was delusional about the extent of the assets he had per Clause 2 of Banks versus Goodfellow. Whichever the case as it stands, I will one day have to tell my wife not to call an ambulance for me because what I do have should be there for her and our child. If this does not shock common sentiments, consider the following. He did this and persisted in finding a new way to inflict sadistic financial and physical suffering after he'd been challenged in this way. In 2005, 7 years before he died, and 7 years before I found this out, he said to his former favorite nephew and my older cousin D that he planned to leave me nothing, absolutely nothing. But he had to backtrack and for a short time save face when D responded to his pronouncement, "Uncle Ray, that's not right." That's not right. Where have we heard that before? Maybe the 1870 decision on testamentary capacity, Banks versus Goodfellow, written by Chief Justice Cockburn, in which he wrote of a perverted sense of right as being an issue preventing testamentary capacity. Cousin D apparently was then able to persuade my father to go to an estate attorney he knew of, and not knowing the specifics of my career, my finances, and my health, Cousin D probably felt he'd succeeded in correcting the course of my father's perverted sense of right. The attorney also did not know from the way he assessed testamentary capacity and my father's covert NPD that things were not really as they appeared. My cousin was named trust advisor, but the damage had been done to his relationship with my father with his criticism, "That's not right." Eventually, my father replaced my cousin as trust advisor with his own second cousins, with whom he'd had very little contact the 60 years previous, meaning they would fall for his convincing act of a beleaguered, disappointed father trying to be a good father and do the best he could for his son. Lies on all fronts. In fact, with the trust limitations and his last-minute generosity, my father still managed to do almost as much harm as he wanted to do when Cousin D told him that's not right 6 years before. In which case, I'd say my father's sense of right was perverted both before he did a will trust and in his last actions and choices, and his testamentary capacity was questionable. If this sounds like Donald Trump ignoring his advisors and lawyers, it is exactly the same. As I was writing this, news broke of Donald Trump ignoring an all-caps warning about congratulating Putin for winning a rigged election. He did so anyway. My father was warned by my cousin, "That's not right," but he still found a way to do what he wanted anyway, literally in the end. It's easy to confuse narcissism with excessive self-love, as in the story from ancient Greece. And it sounds like a banal tautology to say narcissists are egocentric, but don't misunderstand the magnitude of the idea. Long before I realized how appropriate a diagnosis of NPD was, I regularly thought to myself, the world is only what Dad says it is. Indeed, though I've not seen it described this way, narcissists have highly subjective realities, of a kind with small children who have yet to learn that daydreams are not the reality we must all eventually acknowledge as we grow up.